Now, the African Development Bank plans to raise $1 billion in a week's time to support agricultural production in Africa. The bank also wants to shield the continent from potential food shortages arising from the ongoing Russian invasion of Ukraine. Most African countries rely on the two warring nations for their grain supplies. Somalia, Benin, Egypt and Sudan top the list of countries that heavily rely on Russia and Ukraine, with more than 70% of their wheat coming from the two countries. The multilateral lender says it will convene a meeting of finance and agriculture ministers in Africa to roll out that plan. Meanwhile, the African Development Bank's investment boardroom has secured $32.8 billion in investment commitments for the projects in Africa. The bank's president, Akinwumi Adesina, announced at the closing of the meeting with investors on Thursday. Well, joining us now via Zoom for more on this is Chief Economist at Databank Group, Courage Martey, and he joins us from Accra in Ghana. Thanks very much indeed for joining us, Akwaba.
Good afternoon, Peter, and thanks for having me.
Great. So, $1 billion for agricultural support. It sounds like a lot, but when you look at how many countries on the continent, especially needing help, it might not stretch that far.
Yes, Peter, you are right. And if you situate that within a context of a 2017 roadmap, which was launched by the African Development Bank, where it plans to invest $2.4 billion annually over a 10-year period, you would say this is just one of the investments that will go into it. So it sounds like a lot, but it is just one of the aspects of the multiple investments that will go into the agri sector on the continent over a decade period. So it is just the starting point, if you like.
All right. And how does it work? How does one support agriculture in the way that the African Development Bank is envisaging?
Great. So if I go back to the 2017 roadmap that was launched, where they intend to invest annually $2.4 billion over a 10-year period, in that particular launch, the president actually indicated that agriculture is a money-making business. However, at the same time, agriculture is like gold dust, where unless you finish the refining, you are not likely to know what will come out of it. Now, this is an indication of uncertainty. And because of this uncertainty, you don't find a lot of commercial banks and financing institutions going into that sector. As a result of that, there is always limited capacity. So what the AFDB is trying to do is to kind of de-risk the sector, where these kinds of investment in the agriculture sector across the continent would either de-risk the sector or reduce the perceived risk in the sector and catalyze private sector investment into the sector. So the whole idea of this investment is to ensure that the AFDB provides an anchor investment, which will then trigger other investments from other investors into the sector in order to move agriculture towards a money-making venture, which it ought to be, because it is a $1 trillion sector or business activity which is being undervalued because of underinvestments.
And I suppose what we have to do is change the narrative a little bit, because on the one hand, we have a continent that's got the most amount of arable land in the world, and yet we are importing wheat when we should be growing wheat for the whole world.
Exactly. And this is typical of the continent, isn't it? We seem to be a raw material supplying continent, from agriculture to hydrocarbon to minerals. We seem to be a raw material supplying continent for the rest of the world. And the narrative has to change. And specifically speaking to agriculture, this investment we expect will not be just the production of goods from the farm or farm produce, but will also go across the value chain, where we add value to this agriculture output and ensure that we increase our share in the global value chain of some of these products. So you are very right, and I agree with you 100% that the narrative has to change. And if it is going to change, it must include amongst the investment plan value addition, so that we move higher up the value chain and earn a lot more within the global trade value chain.
So first it was COVID-19 that disrupted everything. Now the Ukraine-Russia conflict. Here on the continent, we think that we're so far away, we should be insulated, but it seems as if pretty much all aspects of our economies are going to be touched one way or another by this conflict. Agriculture is one of them, isn't it? Via things like fertilizers produced from countries like Russia.
Exactly. Agriculture is going to be hit hard, particularly from the area of food production, like you mentioned, fertilizer, which is a critical raw material in agri activity, and then food supply. Africa as a whole, we do not produce enough to be self-sufficient, and so we always will have to augment with import. So as a result of this conflict, economic activity in these countries is going to close down. Then there are sanctions on Russia. Now, these sanctions is going to exert a strain on Russia's exports to the rest of the world, including Africa. Now, what this means is that the supply chain disruption, which was started by COVID, is going to get worse. And the pricing of food and food prices will become more elevated and volatile. In fact, I was looking at the IMF data, and according to the IMF, food prices account for almost 40% of the consumer price index in sub-Saharan Africa. And so you can imagine pressure coming on the budget of average Africans as a result of higher food prices. And so really the agriculture sector and food prices is going to be hit real hard, worsening the already supply crunch that was triggered by COVID.
So what's the way forward? I mean, these measures by the AFDB sound like stopgaps. I can only see that, things will probably get worse before they get better.
Yes, and I think so. They will get worse before they get better. And what we expect is that governments across the continent would treat the AFDB's investment as just an anchor investment. And we need to trigger more investment from the government. We need to also trigger policies that help reduce the risk or the perceived risk in the agriculture sector, so that you would have banks feeling confident enough to support the sector. So in addition to this investment from the AFDB, you want to see our government also play a critical role in de-risking the sector, because the major constraint to financing of the sector is the risk in the sector. So you want to see our government creating an avenue that de-risks the sector. At the same time, one of the risks is market risk, where farmers are not guaranteed of available demand for their products or produce. So you want to have a situation where there would be countries creating buffer stock for whatever the farmers are producing. Once you create buffer stock, then there is an assurance that if I produce, there is a place where I will take it to for purchase, the state, the biggest buyer. And this buffer stock will also be a situation or an avenue where we can help stabilize the price of agri produce on the market, safeguard the income of farmers, and also ensure that the citizens across the continent will have supply amidst this crunch in global supply as a result of the Russia-Ukraine crisis. So there is a big role for government to support the AFDB to de-risk the sector and also catalyze private sector investments.
So COVID-19, the great disruptor, but there was hope that the global economy and the continent's economies would start to grow, particularly this year. Does this Ukraine-Russia conflict put brakes on that?
I would say generally it doesn't drag us into recession, but it certainly will pull the brakes on the rate of recovery. So it certainly will slow the rate at which we bounce back. That is for sure. In fact, I was looking at the U.S. Federal Reserve's forecast, and even the U.S. is expected to have a slower than initially expected growth. And that is going to cut across the continent. The areas where you are likely to see growth remaining robust are countries that depend on, say, energy, because we are seeing energy prices skyrocketing. And this is positive for crude oil exporters. But countries like importers would have to suffer some shocks, and that is going to hurt growth in those sectors. So overall, it is not going to be homogeneous constraints across the continent. There are those who benefit from the higher commodity prices, but there are those who also suffer as a result of tighter operating environment, which will tighten the profitability and expansion of businesses.
Are there sectors in the agricultural field that may be spared a little bit? I mean, I'm thinking about your country, one of the largest producers in the world of cocoa. And I just wonder if it's business as usual or that there's a trickle even through seemingly disconnected parts of the agricultural system. Do they get caught up in the ecosystem as well?
Well, they do, particularly cocoa that you mentioned. It's a cash crop for the country. And these are things that would normally go when you have a situation of normalcy around the global economy. We saw the shock when COVID came in, and this is going to be another shock. And so issues like these, sectors like this will suffer one of the biggest shocks. And also poultry will suffer because once you don't get grains coming through, poultry feeds would not be available or will be short in supply. And so the poultry sector could also suffer. And already we are experiencing higher prices for poultry products on the market. And I guess across the continent, similarly, we'll be expecting this kind of shocks as well. So crops, poultry will be the ones that will suffer the biggest hit.
All right, so I'm going to talk again, Ghana as an example. As people go to the shops, have they started to see prices go up directly as a result of the Ukraine-Russia conflict?
Well, yes. And this is coming from two angles. So I must say three angles, actually. First of all, we have food prices going up significantly, sharply. But at the same time, we have fuel prices also going up significantly on the market. And as a result of this, we have prices across the economy going up. Currently, inflation reading for February is at 15.7%. After hitting a low of 7.5% middle of last year, the rise has been very astronomical. Now, this is also being worsened by the currency pressure because the Russia-Ukraine crisis is creating a flight to safety. And so foreign investors on our market are also exiting. And this exit is exerting pressure on the local currency. Now, the higher oil prices on the market also mean, on the global markets, also mean that importers of refined products demand higher forex to bring in the more expensive product. And so it's also hurting the currency further and passing through to fuel prices and ultimately to inflation. And so food and non-food inflation is experiencing steep increases. And in the near term, the outlook is for the upside to continue. And so the Russia-Ukraine crisis is not sparing any country from the shocks. And it is only a matter of time before you start to see central banks across the continent beginning to tighten aggressively. But Ghana, for instance, we're expecting the Bank of Ghana to begin its tightening cycle from Monday because the MPC meeting has started from this week. And we expect that on Monday, there will be an increase in the policy rate to try and control the price pressures.
Courage, Martey, we're going to have to leave it there, but thank you very, very much indeed for joining us and sharing your insights with us. Thanks for your time. Medasi.
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure.
Take care. All right, that's Courage Martey, who's chief economist at Databank Group, speaking to us from Accra in Ghana about the impact the Russia-Ukraine conflict has had on the continent and the efforts by the African Development Bank to try and mitigate these, trying to raise $1 billion for the agricultural sector within the next week.